In section 11.7, we talk about different types of endocrine disorders. Endocrine disorders are really broken into two categories, the first of which is hyposecretion, in other words, not enough hormones being produced, and the second is hypersecretion, too much hormone is being produced. We further divide these into primary hyposecretion, secondary hyposecretion, and the same for hypersecretion. In the case of primary hyposecretion, for one reason or another, the endocrine gland is not producing enough hormone. The endocrine gland itself is not producing enough hormone. And so this typically is a result of one of three factors. One possible factor is the gland has been destroyed partially. A common reason for this would be an autoimmune disorder in which antibodies have inappropriately attacked the cells of the endocrine gland and rendered them unable to produce their product. Another possibility is an enzyme deficiency. This would more likely be a genetic deficiency in which the gland simply cannot produce the hormones that it needs to produce. And lastly, a third cause of primary hyposecretion would be a dietary deficiency. By far the most common here would be an iodine deficiency. As you recall from the first section of this chapter, iodine is necessary for the synthesis of thyroid hormone, and so a lack of iodine in the diet renders the body incapable of producing thyroid hormone. This leads to the formation of a goiter that we see depicted on the upper right-hand side of our slide. And so in this particular case, the thyroid gland is unable to produce thyroid hormone, and because of this negative feedback loop that we'll talk about in the upcoming sections, the thyroid gland is bombarded by thyroid-stimulating hormone, which is the hormone responsible for causing the production of thyroid hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone is both a tropic hormone and a trophic hormone. As you recall from our last section, those definitions. Tropic means that it's a hormone that causes another gland to produce a hormone. Trophic means that that particular stimulating hormone determines the size of its target gland. And so in this case, because thyroid hormone is bombarded by thyroid-stimulating hormone, the thyroid gland increases in size, creating this disorder that we refer to as a goiter. Another possibility in the case of hyposecretion is secondary hyposecretion. In this particular case, the gland is receiving too little stimulation. It's not the gland's responsibility that it's not producing enough hormone, like in the case of thyroid hormone. If the thyroid gland is capable of producing thyroid hormone, if there's plenty of iodine and no enzyme deficiencies, but it receives too little thyroid-stimulating hormone, that would be an example of secondary hyposecretion. The stimulating hormone is produced at a level that is too low. Most commonly, both of these disorders are treated by simply providing the missing hormone. That's certainly the case in thyroid hormone disorders, and so thyroxine, or a synthetic analog of thyroxine, actually is given to replace that missing hormone. So the other possibility is hypersecretion. In the case of hypersecretion, you're producing too much of a particular hormone. And by far the most, so we divide it up into two categories: primary hypersecretion and secondary hypersecretion. In the case of primary hypersecretion, the gland itself is producing too much of its hormone, and by far the most common reason for this would be a tumor that forms from the cells of the gland itself. Gigantism would be a very common example of this, the overproduction of growth hormone in the juvenile and adolescent stage of a human's life before those growth plates fuse. And so this is, of course, what Andre the Giant, as we'll talk about later, suffered from and led him to grow to a height of 7'4", I believe. And almost always, gigantism is caused by an adrenal tumor, and it is, of course, an example of primary hypersecretion because the anterior pituitary is simply producing too much of its hormone. The other possibility, as you would imagine in the case of hypersecretion, is secondary hypersecretion. And so in this particular case, the tropic hormones are too high. So going back to the thyroid hormone example, thyroid stimulating hormone is, of course, the hormone that causes the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. And so if thyroid stimulating hormone levels are too high, then it would lead to inappropriately high production of thyroid gland, of thyroid hormone by the thyroid gland. And so that would be an example of secondary hypersecretion. The cause of the elevated hormone levels would be the elevated levels of the tropic hormone. Other endocrine disorders include hyporesponsiveness and hyperresponsiveness to a particular hormone. In the case of hyporesponsiveness, the target cells become unresponsive to the hormone. The best example of this would be type 2 diabetes. Well, at least the most widespread example of this would be type 2 diabetes. In the case of type 2 diabetes, the pancreas produces insulin, the receptors are present, but the receptors no longer respond appropriately to the binding of insulin, and so it's a good example of hyporesponsiveness. There are multiple causes of hyporesponsiveness. One possibility is a receptor deficiency. For example, some humans that are genetic males simply lack androgen receptors as a result of the genes that they possess. And therefore, even though they produce testosterone, they don't respond to it, and so they don't develop the secondary sex characteristics that would be expected to be observed in a human male. Another possibility is a signaling pathway problem. And so something like a cyclic AMP deficiency in the second messenger system that carries the signal from the receptor, which is still intact, to the machinery, molecular machinery that produces the hormone within the cell. A third possibility is a deficiency of enzymes that activate the hormone. And so a good example in this case would be the transformation of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone. A lack of enzymes that facilitate that conversion results in a reduction in the secondary sex characteristics observed in those individuals. Lastly, we can have hyperresponsiveness as an endocrine disorder. And so in the case of hyperresponsiveness, one of the most common causes is an upregulation in the number of receptors for that particular hormone. For example, we talked previously about the permissive effects that thyroid hormone has on epinephrine, and we explain that by saying that thyroid hormone causes an increased number in the receptors for epinephrine that are present on a cell. Therefore, it would make sense that in the case of hyperthyroidism, when you have high levels of thyroid hormone, you have an increased number of receptors for epinephrine, and therefore an elevated response to epinephrine, and things like, for instance, an elevated heartbeat in response to levels of epinephrine that should not generate this fight or flight response. In section 11.8, we begin our discussion of the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands. These glands are often known as the master endocrine glands of the body because they control many of the other endocrine glands that are found in the body. If we look at the hypothalamus and the pituitary, we notice that the pituitary, shown here in the lower right-hand side of our diagram, is nestled in the sella turcica. So if you follow the pointer here, here we have the pituitary, roughly the size of a pea. Here we have it in a cross-section of the brain, so it's located in the bottom of your brain there, roughly the size of a pea, nestled in the sella turcica. The pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum. This is the infundibulum that we see here. The connection between the infundibulum and the hypothalamus is known as the median eminence. And so that's our basic anatomy of the hypothalamus, median eminence, infundibulum, and pituitary gland, nestled in the sella turcica. We notice a very distinct difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary. In the case of the posterior pituitary, we have nuclei that contain neurons, cell bodies, that produce hormones that are transported via their axons and axonal transport all the way down to the posterior pituitary. These axons terminate on capillaries that are found in the posterior pituitary, releasing these hormones that were produced in the hypothalamus into the bloodstream. And so that's the function of the posterior pituitary. It produces no hormones, but it releases hormones produced in the hypothalamus. What we notice is that the anterior pituitary is quite different. In the case of the anterior pituitary, we once again have nuclei that are found in the hypothalamus. We once again produce hormones, but those hormones are released into this capillary bed, found in the median eminence. Those hormones enter the blood, and they travel via these portal vessels. And so this is one of the two instances in the body where we see this thing referred to as a portal system. The hormones produced in the hypothalamus travel via the portal vessels, and they are released in the anterior pituitary. They bind to their target cells, causing the production of hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. Those, in turn, enter the capillary bed and then go on and go through general circulation. So a couple reminders here. What is a portal vein, or what's a portal system? Well, a portal system is a situation in the body in which you have two capillary beds before you get back to the heart. Typically, everywhere else in the body except for the hepatic portal system found in the digestive system, we go to heart, arteries, capillary beds, skipping a few vessels there, and then we go from the capillary bed to veins back to the heart. But in this case, in the case of a portal system, we go heart, capillary bed, portal vessels, a second capillary bed, and then we go back to the heart. So what is a portal system doing here? Well, clearly, this is adaptive in this scenario because the hormones that are released in the hypothalamus, their only function is to control the release of hormones by the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is I hope we've made clear, is under direct control of the hypothalamus via these hormones. And so if this portal system was not in place, the hormones would be released here, have to go through general circulation to get back to this point that's only a few centimeters away. The portal system allows the hormones to be produced here, enter circulation right here, travel through the portal vessels, and then be released on the anterior pituitary. This means that much lower concentrations of the hormone can be produced relative to what would need to be produced if these hormones traveled through general circulation. What we see is this, that in the case of the posterior pituitary, we produce two hormones. Maybe I should rephrase that. In the case of the posterior pituitary, we release two hormones. We talked just a moment ago about how the hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary are produced in the hypothalamus. The hormones released here allow the brain to function something like a endocrine gland, because it allows the brain to release hormones very rapidly upon the appropriate stimulation. The hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary are released when the appropriate signal is received, and those axons located in the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, send signals to their axon terminals that allow the fusion of those vesicles, similar to what we talked about, of course, in the case of neurotransmitters, and the release of those hormones into the bloodstream. The two hormones, as you know, that are produced here are oxytocin and vasopressin. Vasopressin is also known as ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin has two major functions. One of the functions is the release, not the production, but the release of milk following stimulation of a nursing infant. The second function of oxytocin is contraction of the uterus during parturition, or the birthing process. And so this is, of course, one of the rare examples of positive feedback in physiology that we have cited previously. Oxytocin is thought also to play a role in pair bonding and perhaps other emotional states, leading to things like this little illustration that says I, and this is the structure of oxytocin, you, I. If oxytocin promotes pair bonding, that's of course substituted for I love you. If that's the case, interestingly, then that is almost certainly the release of oxytocin from other areas in the brain, because There's no evidence that oxytocin can cross the blood-brain barrier, so the oxytocin released from the posterior pituitary is not likely to make its way back into the brain. The second hormone that we discuss that is released by the posterior pituitary is vasopressin, and also known as antidiuretic hormone. This is a hormone that, as the name would indicate, promotes smooth muscle contraction, and so it increases blood pressure in response to an injury by causing reduction of the overall volume of the circulatory system, assuming that there's blood loss, and that can be compensated for to some extent by the release of vasopressin and contraction of smooth muscle and the narrowing of the blood vessels of the body. It also decreases water excretion, a function that we're probably more familiar with in the kidneys, and so we'll talk about its impact on the distal tubules of the kidneys in the renal system chapter. We make our way now to the anterior pituitary and the hormones that are released there. So what we notice is this, that the hormones released from the anterior pituitary are under the control of what we refer to as hypophysiotrophic hormones. Hypophysiotrophic hormones are hypothalamic hormones, in other words, hormones released by the hypothalamus that regulate the anterior pituitary. Often, these are the first hormone in a three-hormone cascade, as we see illustrated in this diagram from our text. So let's go through this little figure very briefly, the one on the left-hand side. We have a stimulus. That stimulus brings about the production of the hypophysiotrophic hormone, the first hormone in this sequence. So the plasma concentration of this hormone goes up. This hormone goes to the anterior pituitary, causing the anterior pituitary to increase secretion of its hormone. The plasma concentrations of that hormone go up. This anterior pituitary hormone is going to circulate through the body and find a particular endocrine gland and have an impact on that gland. And so that endocrine gland is going to produce whatever hormone it makes. The plasma concentration of that hormone goes up. And then as a result of that, that hormone number 3, is going to bind to the target cells and have its response. So there are 3 hormones involved overall in getting to this overall goal of having the target cells respond to a particular hormone. Let's look at an example briefly, one that we'll talk about in more detail later, but on the right-hand side, we have such a cascade as we just discussed. So we have the hypothalamus in this case, and the hypophysiotrophic hormone that it releases here is thyroid-releasing hormone, TRH. TRH is a hypothalamic hormone that goes to the anterior pituitary and causes the anterior pituitary to release its hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone then goes to the thyroid gland, causing the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone, and then thyroid hormone goes through the body and binds to receptors found in nearly every cell of the body. As we look at the anterior pituitary, we see that it produces a number of hormones, many more than the 2 that are released, not produced, by the posterior pituitary. There are 8 total, 6 that have clear physiological roles, and all of these are peptides. The 2 that don't have clear physiological roles in human physiology are beta-lipotrophin, which, at least in animal models, utilizes fat stores as an energy source, and beta-endorphins, which do appear to be associated with the relief of pain in animal models. But in humans, this function has not been clearly established. So we focus on the 6 that do have a clear physiological role in humans, and they are listed here, and their roles are shown in the figure at the bottom of our slide. Beginning at the left-hand side, we have the so-called gonadotropins. So the gonadotropins are follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. These 2 hormones have dual roles. They both play a role in the production of the gametes, the eggs and sperm, as illustrated in the bottom left-hand corner of our diagram. And they also play a role in the promotion of the production of the sex hormones by the gonads, the production of 17-beta-estradiol in females and testosterone in males. Making our way to the left, we see that we next get to growth hormone. Growth hormone, of course, has a profound impact on overall growth muscle development, and the maintenance of systems in the body. It exerts this impact via two mechanisms, overall mechanisms. One is on the liver and some other cells, in which it increases the production of insulin growth factor 1. And on the other hand, it also has growth promoting effects, including protein synthesis and the actual metabolism of carbohydrates and lipids in many other organs and tissues that are found in the body. We'll talk about growth hormone in more detail in just a few moments. The next hormone that we have, making our way further to the right, is thyroid stimulating hormone, one that we've talked about several times, including in the example that we used previously. Thyroid stimulating hormone, of course, goes to the thyroid gland and causes the production of thyroxine and triiodothyronine, T4 and T3, respectively. Okay, so making our way one more to the right, we have prolactin next. Prolactin does not cause the release of milk, but it plays a role, at least, along with estrogen in the development of mammary glands and in the production of milk. It may have something to do with reproductive function in males, although that function is not clear. It has other interesting functions in non-mammalian vertebrates like salmon. It's been demonstrated that disruption of prolactin just confuses salmon as they make their way back upstream to spawn. The last hormone we have to the right is adrenocorticotrophic hormone. In adrenocorticotrophic hormone, ACTH, its target is the adrenal cortex, and so it causes primarily the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. So we take a moment here to remind ourselves, before we talk about the hypophysiotrophic hormones, how they are released and how they exert their impact. And so, of course, they're produced in the hypothalamus, as we see in this picture from our diagram from our text. They enter the capillary bed of this hypothalamo-pituitary portal system in the median eminence. They travel through the portal vessels. They exit the portal vessels in the anterior pituitary, binding to cells, their target cells, that bring about production of one of the 6 hormones we just discussed, or possibly one of the 8 hormones that we just discussed. Those hormones then, as you can see, make their way back into circulation, and then those go back to the heart into general circulation. And so it's an efficient system, as we mentioned, because you can produce a much lower concentration, a lower overall volume of these hypophysiotrophic hormones, the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus and control production of hormones in the anterior pituitary. So we've already talked about the hormones that were released by the anterior pituitary. And at this point, we want to back up one step and talk about the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus that cause the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. These are the hormones, of course, that inhibit or encourage the release of anterior pituitary hormones. And in some cases, there's 2, like in the case of growth hormone that we see here. So briefly, if we look at this figure from our text, we have all of these hormones outlined for us. The control of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone is under the control of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, produced by the hypothalamus. If we go to growth hormone, we see we have 2 hormones, as we mentioned. We have growth hormone-releasing hormone, GHRH, and we also have somatostatin, which obviously causes a reduction in the production of growth hormone, whereas growth hormone-releasing hormone obviously causes an increase. We've talked several times now about thyroid-releasing hormone, which goes to the anterior pituitary and causes an increase in production of thyroid-stimulating hormone. Interestingly, dopamine, that we mentioned a little while ago as well, goes to the anterior pituitary and causes the production of prolactin. It inhibits the production of prolactin. Prolactin is a little different because it's the only hormone of these 6 that doesn't have another endocrine gland as its target. Prolactin, of course, is causing development of the mammary glands and the production of milk, but it's not causing the release of a second hormone. And in the case of the adrenocorticotrophic hormone, it's under control of corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH, and so it's, of course, corticotropin-releasing hormone causes the production of adrenocorticotrophic hormone, which then causes the release of cortisol. So in most cases, we have a 3-hormone sequence. As long as we count insulin growth factor as a hormone for growth hormone. But in the case of prolactin, we have a 2-hormone sequence. What we see is this, that as you would expect, negative feedback is very important in controlling the release of all these hormones. And we like to talk about short loop and long loop negative feedback on the release of these hormones. So if we follow this diagram, what we see is the following. We've been through this diagram before. All we've done is add these little arrows. So in this case, we have the plasma hormone that's produced by the endocrine gland itself. Thyroid hormone would be a good example. And what we see is that thyroid hormone goes back and it has a negative, it shuts down its production. It has a negative impact on the production of the hormone produced by the anterior pituitary that's causing its production, thyroid stimulating hormone in the case of thyroid hormone, and it has a negative impact on the production of the hypophysiotrophic hormone that is the hormone produced by the hypothalamus that is causing the release of the anterior pituitary hormone. In the case of thyroid hormone, that's thyroid releasing hormone. So it's long loop negative feedback because it is the third hormone that's exerting this negative impact on the previous 2 glands, producing those 2 hormones that are necessary in order to produce the third one. Now, that wouldn't work in the case of prolactin, as you recall from our previous slide, because prolactin doesn't have a third hormone. So in the case of prolactin, what we notice is this, that prolactin makes its way back to the hypothalamus, and it actually causes an increase in the production of dopamine. Dopamine, as you recall, causes a decrease in the production of prolactin, and so prolactin controls itself via this short loop negative feedback. Short loop negative feedback because it's being controlled by the second plasma hormone. We notice that in the case of growth hormone, which would be the second hormone here as well, we do see some short loop negative feedback that's active in the control of the release of growth hormone. Lastly, we notice that sometimes hormones that are not part of this picture at all have an impact on the production of hormones within this sequence. And so we refer to these, of course, as non-sequence hormones. A good example would be estradiol, which has a positive impact on the production of prolactin, even though it's not directly part of any of the situation that we see here in this diagram, including the feedback.